Welcome to Part 3 of training for new modifications made to CAPS for APS placements, services, and expenditures. In this training, we will learn how to enter service requests. First, let's do a quick review. CAPS has a new tab where you will find most of the new modifications for APS. The tab is called the Placement, Services, Payment tab, which is abbreviated as you see on this slide. The new tab contains 4 subtabs. The first one is the Placement subtab. Second is the Services subtab. Third is the Level of Care subtab. And fourth is the P-Card subtab. Notice that the bottom of the Placement and Services subtabs have fields to show how much money we estimate we're spending on this adult. Additional costs such as food, clothing, and prescriptions, the total we have paid so far for placements and services, and the level of care are also shown at the bottom of the screen. A total amount for all entries that have a cost associated with them will show here. Now we'll enter a request for a service. Begin by clicking the Placements Services Payment tab, then click the Services subtab. Click Update in the upper right corner. Then click the Add button in the lower right corner. The APS Services screen will open. The service type drop-down has 2 options, contracted services and one-time or intermittent services. This training will demonstrate how to enter a request for a contracted service. The service criteria drop-down shows the different contracted services APS has. APS emergency stabilization beds, family group conferencing, homemaker services, personal care assistant services, also known as sitter services, and transitional supported living. Currently, APS does not have a contracted provider for transitional supported living, but we are seeking one and hope this service will be available at some point. First, enter the start date. The end date for a contracted service will populate based on the service you select. However, if you need the service for a different time frame, you can change the end date. This works the same for all contracted service types. I selected personal care assistant services and the end date populated 2 weeks after the start date. This is the suggested amount of time for personal care assistant services and should only be changed for a shorter time frame or in special circumstances where a longer time frame has been approved. 3 days before the end date, the case manager will receive an email notification to submit a new request if these services are needed for an additional 2 weeks. The Requested By field populates with the name of the CAPS user making the request, and the funding type populates with APS funded. This slide shows an example of changing the end date. It populated with a date of 9/14/2022, which is 2 weeks after the start date, but I changed the end date to 9/9/2022. The fields outlined in red on this screen are populated from information entered in other screens in CAPS. The case manager will manually enter information in the fields outlined in red on this screen. Although no information is entered for this demonstration, it's important to enter as much of this information as possible so that the request will not be sent back to you marked incomplete. Next, click the Search button to enter the provider. The search screen opens, but it will not allow you to enter the name of the provider. That's because all providers who are contracted for a particular type of service are already entered in CAPS. Click the Search button in the upper right corner of the screen to see a list of these providers. The providers who are contracted to provide personal care assistant services are shown in the red box. Note, this demonstration shows the test version of CAPS, so you do not see all of our actual providers listed here. They are listed in the production version of CAPS that you use. Click the provider you want to use, then click the Select button. The provider's name appears in the Provider field. Click on the Placement Services tab to complete the information that you currently complete on the Form 35772. Notice that the unit type and unit dollar amount fields are populated. This information comes from the contract for the provider that has been entered in caps. Make a selection for Initial Request and Other Services Sought. Enter the number of hours per day and days per week that you are requesting services. The PCA HM hours authorized, estimated daily cost, and estimated total cost fields are computed and populated for you based on the number of hours and days you entered. Enter answers in the fields for the questions shown in the red box. Enter detailed information in the Reason for Request box to prevent the request from being returned to you as incomplete. Select the length of time this adult has received personal care assistant services. If the adult has received these services for more than 90 days, you must staff this request with your supervisor and regional director. If the adult has received these services for more than 180 days, this case must be included on the next case review with the DSS director for your region. Enter the requested date and select your supervisor from the drop-down menu. Other supervisors are listed in case someone is covering for your supervisor when you make this request. Finally, click the Submit button. I entered myself as the supervisor to show how the rest of the process works. This is not possible in the real CAPS world. Next, click the Submit button. The Save button will save your work, but it will not submit the request to your supervisor for approval. Click the Commit button in the upper right corner of the screen to complete the request process. You will get the message shown on this slide reminding you to enter additional placements or services for this adult. If there are no more to enter, click OK. Click Cancel to enter more requests. The supervisor will receive an alert notification that you sent him or her a request. The supervisor will click Alerts at the top of the screen. The alert screen will open. Click on the underlined blue number to take you directly to the case that contains the request. Also, the description field shows this is a service request, which lets you know to click on the Services tab in the case file. Make selections for the Recipient and Program Service drop-downs. The Placement Services Payment tab will appear once you make these selections. Click on this tab when it appears. Remember that the alert showed that the request is for a service. Click on the Services tab within the Placement Services Payment screen. Look for the status of the request in the last column of the grid to determine which one you need to work on. It will have a status of Submitted to Supervisor. You can also look for the request number in the description field of the alert. It's listed in the Service Key column on the left side of the grid shown here. Click the line for the request you want to work with and highlight it. Then click the Update button in the upper right corner of the screen. Click the Update button in the lower right corner next. The APS Services screen will open. Review all the information on the Case Information tab. Then click on the Placement Services tab and review the information there. This request is to continue personal care assistant services that have been in place for 120 days or more, so it requires a staffing with your supervisor and regional director. The supervisor will select authorized or denied as the action, enter the date, and select the regional director to send the request to for staffing. All regional directors are included in the drop-down in case someone is covering for your regional director. Click the Submit button at the bottom of the page. The Save button will save your work, but it will not submit the request to your regional director for approval. The status now shows as Staffing Decision Pending. The regional director will receive an alert notification. Open the alert on the alert screen. Click on the underlined blue number to go directly to the case that contains the request. Notice this is a request for a service in the description box, which means you click on the Services tab within the case file. Make selections for the recipient and program service drop-downs. The Placement, Services, Payments tab will appear once you make these selections. Click on this tab when it appears. The regional director will open the request from the Services tab of the Placement, Services, Payment screen and review the information on the Case Information and Services tabs. He or she will select Approved or Denied as the staffing decision. If the staffing decision is approved, the regional director will check the Reviewed box, enter a date, select the state approver for this type of service, and click the Submit button. The Save button will save your work, but it will not submit the request to the state approver for approval. The state approver will receive an alert notification. Click on Alerts at the top of the screen, then click on the underlined blue number to go directly to the case. Notice in the description that this request is for a service. Make selections for the recipient and program services drop-down, then click the Placement, Services, Payments tab. Again, this is a request for a service. The screen opens to the Placements tab, so you will click the Services tab to get to the request needing your attention. Look for the request with the status of Submitted to Approver, or look for the request number shown in the description field of the alert screen. That number will appear in the service key column on the left side of the screen. Click on the line for the request you want to work with and highlight it in blue. Then click Update in the upper right corner of the screen. Then click Update in the lower right corner of the screen. The request will open. Review the information on the Case Information tab. Then click the Placements Services tab and review the information on it. If you want to review a paper copy of the request, click the Generate 35772 button. A PDF document will appear that you can print by clicking the green button. If you approve the request after reviewing it, click Approved as the action, enter the date, and click the Submit button. The status will show as approved, and the estimated cost fields at the bottom of the screen are updated. The case manager will receive an email that the request has been approved. Now we will briefly look at the other contracted service types. A request for emergency stabilization beds will automatically populate an end date 2 months after the start date, as well as the unit type and dollar amount entered in the contract section of CAPS for this provider. The funding type for emergency stabilization beds is APS funded. A family group conferencing request will automatically populate an end date with the same date as the start date. It will also populate the unit type and unit dollar amount entered in the contract section of CAPS for this provider. The funding type for family group conferencing is VOCA. A request for transitional supported living will populate an end date 2 months after the start date. CAPS will also populate the unit type and unit dollar amount entered in the contract section of CAPS for this provider. CAPS will generate a notification to the case manager 3 days before the end date for requests like this one that have a predetermined end date to allow the case manager to enter another request if the services need to be extended. The funding type for transitional supported living is APS funded. Thank you for your time today. The next training session will cover one-time or intermittent service request.